Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're driving the Panzer IV German tank in realistic battles. So we got a match on Ardennes here, a domination match. So the Panzer IV, commonly known, the Panzerkampfwagen IV, commonly known as the Panzer IV, was a German medium tank developed in the late 1930s and used extensively during the Second World War. Its ordnance inventory designation was SD-KFZ 161. The Panzer IV was the most widely manufactured German tank and the second most widely manufactured German armored fighting vehicle of the Second World War, with some 8,500 built. Panzer IV chassis was used as the base for many other fighting vehicles, including the Sturmgeschütz IV assault gun, the Jagdpanzer IV tank destroyer, and the Wirbelwind self-propelled anti-aircraft gun. Also, the Brummbär self-propelled gun was built on the Panzer IV chassis as well. So, the Germans, when they first started blitzkrieging people, they had Panzer IIs, which were actually terrible. They only had a 20mm gun. And what really made the Germans win was their tactics. They used radios, command tanks, and they bunched all their tanks together and just rushed the enemy. Whereas the people they were attacking, especially the French, they had tanks in an infantry support role. So they were just designed to help out the infantry. They weren't really prepared for a massive German armor. So even though the French tanks were superior, and most of the tanks the German Panzer IIs faced were superior, the Panzer II still won because of their tactics. So the Germans started working on the Panzer III after they realized the Panzer II was inferior, and then they developed the Panzer IV. So throughout the whole war, the Panzer tank is kind of like the Sherman of the Germans. It's their go-to vehicle, it's their jack-of-all-trades. And the Panzer IV was the final version of it, of their jack-of-all-trades vehicle. Like they used Panzer IIIs, started with Panzer IIs, and then Panzer IV was the last one. Because most people think of the German tanks, they think of the Tiger or the Panther, but those tanks were somewhat unreliable. And the Panzer IVs and Sturmgeschütz tanks actually took out a lot more of the enemy tanks than the Panthers or Tigers ever did. So this is my favorite tanks for the Germans. The Panzer IVs, the different variants of the Panzer IVs, and the Panzer IIIs are my favorite. If I had to choose between them, I'd probably say I like the Panzer III, just because, I don't know, there's just something about it. But the Panzer IV was definitely a more advanced tank. So the Panzer IV saw service in all combat theaters involving Germany and was the only German tank to remain in continuous production throughout the war. It received various upgrades and design modifications intended to counter new threats, extending its service life. Generally, these involved increasing the Panzer IV's armor. As you can see, there's some side armor around the turret there, and on the sides of the hull as well, with some tracks. Or upgrading its weapons, that was another thing they did. Although during the last months of the war, with Germany's need for rapid replacement of losses, design changes also included simplifications to speed up the manufacturing process. So basically, German tanks were too complicated, and that's the reason why they lost the war. And although I have massive respect for the Tiger and the Panther, and other German tanks, like the Jagdpanzer, you know, some of their more marvelous tanks, the Panzer IVs and the Panzer IIIs were the working men, if you will, of the tank force. They did a lot of the actual work, as well as the Sturmgeschütz. So the Panzer IV was partially succeeded by the Panther tank. which was introduced to counter the Soviet T-34. Although the Panzer IV continued as a significant component of German armored formations to the end of the war, so the Panther never really replaced it. These Panzer IVs were still doing everything the Panther could do, and because they were so much easier to build and maintain and run, they were never really replaced by the Panther, even though that was the idea. The Panzer IV was also the most widely exported tank in German service. So they, you can see, we can see an enemy tank here, but we can't actually fire our guns because we're repairing. So we're just hopeless here. But the Panzer IV was the most widely exported, with over 300 sold to Finland, Romania, Spain, and Bulgaria. After the war, Syria produced Panzer IVs from France and Czechoslovakia, which saw combat in the 1967 Six-Day War. So these Panzer IVs were actually still being used by Syria in 1967. That's crazy. 8,553 Panzer IVs of all versions were built during World War II, with only the Stug 3 assault gun, 10,086 vehicle production number, exceeding that. So, like I said, the Stugs and the Panzer IVs, with over 18,000 vehicles built between them, those were the real German workhorses. Those were the ones that did most of the killing. The Panthers and the Tigers were sort of, because they couldn't build so many of them, I don't know the exact percentages, but I think it was like a 10% chance that you'd even see a Tiger or a Panther in your entire career in the war if you were an Allied soldier. You know, which doesn't make the ones who actually ran into them feel any better, but there wasn't too many of them around. So that's the reason why I respect the Panzers a lot more than I respect the Tiger and the Panther. Even though the engineering of the Tiger and the Panther is better, in terms of purpose, the Panzer IV performed a lot more in terms of work. So where are we at in this game? Well, we've captured C. The enemy has A and B, but we're trying to take A back. Well, we're actually fighting for A right now. They've got B, we've got C, so we've captured C. Went through one hell of a time, lost 2 of our crew members and some of our armor, as you can see. So we're heading back to A to see if we can help out our team here. This version of the Panzer IV I'm driving was a command tank, so it's got several different antennas on it. And the turret actually turns quite slow on this version. I'm not sure why that is, but it's certainly a pain in the ass when you're playing the game. But this is a premium tank, so that's why I choose to use it even though it has this turret here. So the Panzer IV was the brainchild of the German general and innovative warfare theorist Heinz Guderian. In concept, it was intended to be a support tank for use against enemy anti-tank guns and fortifications. Ideally, each tank battalion in a Panzer division was to have 3 medium companies of Panzer IIIs and 1 heavy company of Panzer IVs. So the Panzer IIIs would sort of deal with most of it, and if they had any problems, the Panzer IVs would come in and mop it up. So on 11th of January 1934, the German army wrote specifications for a medium tractor. Remember, they were using the code word tractor because under the previous agreement of World War I, they weren't supposed to be building or researching or designing these tanks, even though they were. So they used the name tractor to disguise it. So they issued them to a number of defense companies to build this medium tractor to support the Panzer III, which would be armed with a 37mm anti-tank gun. So the new vehicle would have a short-barreled howitzer-like 75mm. And we're talking about the very early versions, not this version I'm playing here in War Thunder, which has a long-barreled gun, high velocity. We're talking about the short-barreled, low-velocity howitzer guns on the first Panzer IVs and IIIs. So they had a 37mm howitzer on the Panzer III, and they wanted a 75mm howitzer to support it on the Panzer IV. So the weight limit for the design was 24 tons. and it was carried out under the name Wagen Accompanying Vehicle, or BW, to disguise its actual purpose, given that Germany was still theoretically bound by the Treaty of Versailles' ban on tanks. So MAN, Krupp, and Rheinmetall Borsig each developed prototypes, with Krupp's being selected for further development. So the chassis had originally been designed with a six-wheeled Schlachtel Offwork interleaved road wheel suspension. Pardon me for my awful German. As German half-tracks had already adopted. So they basically wanted to go with a similar suspension to the German half-tracks, but the German army amended this to a torsion bar system for greater vertical deflection of the road wheels, and it was intended to improve performance and crew comfort on and off the road. However, the urgent requirement for the new tank, neither proposal was adopted, and Krupp instead equipped it with a very simple leaf spring double bogie suspension system with 8 rubber-rimmed road wheels per side. So due to timing issues, they just basically went with a simple suspension design. The prototype required a crew of 5 men. The hull contained the engine bay to the rear with the driver and radio operator, who doubled as the hull machine gunner, seated at the front left and the front right respectively. In the turret, the tank commander sat beneath his roof hatch, while the gunner was situated to the left of the gun breech, and the loader to the right. The turret was offset 66.5 millimeters to the left of the chassis center line, while the engine was moved 152 millimeters to the right. This was done so the torque shaft could clear the rotary base junction, which provided electrical power to turn the turret, while connecting to the transmission box. The transmission box was mounted in the hull between the driver and radio operator. Due to the asymmetric layout, the right side of the tank contained the bulk of its stowage volume, which was taken up by ready-use ammunition lockers. So production began in 1936 at Friedkrupp Grossenwerk AG factory at Magdeburg. The first version that was produced was the Panzer IV Ausführung A, abbreviated to OFS-A, or the Panzer IV-A, meaning it meant variant A. So I'm just going to say Panzer IV-A. That was in 1936, and it was powered by Maybach's HL108TR, which produced 183.87 kilowatts. It used a transmission with 5 forward gears and 1 reverse gear, and it had a maximum road speed of 31 kilometers per hour. This was the very early version, by the way. And it had that short-barreled howitzer, like 75mm gun on it. So the Germans had used these shorter guns, and they ran into the British infantry tanks, the Matilda and the Matilda II, during the Battle of France. And the Germans tested a 50mm gun based on the PaK-38 anti-tank gun on a Panzer IV-D. However, they canceled that order. Basically, the Germans ran into the Matilda tank, and the Matilda had anywhere from 75mm of cast iron armor on it, so they were really shocked. And they ran into this thing in the Battle of France, as well as in Africa a lot. So the only way Rommel could actually take these things out was to fire an 88mm flak cannon at it, anti-aircraft gun. And he was panicking one day. These Matildas were closing in, and he's just like, okay, use the anti-aircraft guns, boys. So that's what they did. So that's what led the Germans to develop the long-barreled 75mm gun. When they ran into these heavy armored tanks, they realized, oh my God, we can't penetrate this armor, so we need to build something better. So that's how that all started. But these Panzer IVs were originally using pretty much obsolete weapons in terms of tank versus tank warfare. They were more anti-infantry howitzer weapons for people who are in dug-in positions. You know, you could fire off a high explosive round into like a trench position and just blow the whole squad out of there. So that's more or less what they were for when they were first invented. So the later versions, the Panzer IV F2, they had the KWK 40L43 anti-tank gun, which was developed to counter the Soviet T-34 and medium tank and the KV-1 heavy tank. Basically, on the 26th of May, 1941, weeks before Operation Barbarossa, a conference with Hitler, during a conference with Hitler, it was decided to improve the Panzer IV's main armament. So Krupp was awarded the contract to integrate, again, a 50mm gun into the turret. So the first prototype was developed by 1941. Within months, they encountered the Soviet T-34 and KV-1 tanks with only the 50mm gun. And they realized, oh my god, we need a way better gun than this. So they got Krupp again in a joint development with Rheinmetall to modify Rheinmetall's pending 75mm anti-tank gun design, later known as the 7.5cm Pak 40 L46. So the recoil length was initially too great for the tank's turret, so the recoil mechanism and chamber were shortened. And that's where you get the KWK 40L43, which you see on this tank. And these guns were actually really nose heavy, so the front of the tank suspension was under constant compression. So I hope you guys enjoyed that little bit of history. Sorry if I paused for some moments there. I am reading some of my notes on these tanks, so I don't have to memorize everything. But thanks very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the battle and my little history session. But I hope you can tell how much I love these tanks and respect the Wehrmacht who use them.